What we saw at the clinic, when you talk to patients, is that basically everyone has some sort of cognitive decline, regardless of the diagnosis. Like you mentioned, Lyme is a big one. We see a lot of that in our clinic, and you definitely have that brain fog and severe kind of cognitive impairment. But across the board, even when you had, let's say, a gastrointestinal Crohn's or IBS, ulcerative colitis, all of that also impaired. So it's such a common thing these days, but I also feel like the normalization of cognitive decline, that you're going to get it, is so off. And that's totally really unsettling. And again, now it's become a post-COVID symptom, right? Long haulers you may have brain fog. In your research, did you see anything that actually backs that up? Or should we be looking at maybe the underlying factors of isolation as part of that?
Well, in the research that I was doing for the articles that I've written for Innovative Medicine weren't super focused on COVID, but I personally think it could be a result of both. I think there's so much information and research out there about social isolation and mental health and that correlation, and mental health also being directly related to cognitive decline. Individuals who are really suffering with depression or anxiety or trauma can report things similar to brain fog or just this inability to focus and get things done and be productive and creative. And then aside from just social isolation, I think with COVID, in the very early stages of it, and then also when if you get it, is that isolation from being outside and that disconnect from fresh air and the sun and nature. And I think too, there's plenty of research that kind of directly connects, not getting enough sunshine and time outside with mental health as well. But then on the other side of the spectrum, does it relate to the actual infection? And I think that's really possible as well, because we see that with chronic Lyme disease, for an example, that when the body is fighting an infection and trying to heal, it's this major energy suck, right? Of like the body trying to come back to this wonderful state of homeostasis and maintain that. And, I think too, when you're sick, there's also the mental side of that as well. Of, feeling, you feel terrible and you're not being able to do the things that you want to do. And maybe somebody who has long COVID and is dealing with that for a long period of time, I think that could get you pretty down. And I think too, it doesn't necessarily even have to be connected to long COVID. Like I recently had COVID for the first and hopefully only time, and was miserable for a week. I was so sick and totally isolated, to keep my family safe who didn't have it. And ironically, that's at the end of that, that's when I was writing this article about cognitive decline. And it took me, 3 times as long as it should have to write it, because I just was slow. I had major brain fog. And even after I came out of COVID and was testing negative again, for several weeks, I felt that way, where it was just taking me a lot longer to do things. And so I think it's the result of, like you said, being connected to other, patients coming in with a whole array of issues, and everybody kind of having some form of cognitive decline in their journey from sickness to health.
Well, there are so many factors involved in this, like any disease. You can't just put it on one thing, that it's a virus or it's just the pathogen or it's, anything else. It's even, as we know, toxins. There are tons of neurotoxins out there. They are just in the air, in our food, in our water.
Everything.
Fluoride, right? It's kind of wild how much we got going against us. But I will say, and again, you said this, and I'm looking at that beautiful backdrop of nature, that I believe that the isolation and in general, just the amount of people that are indoors for such long hours. I know it when I was sick, and I don't know, I didn't test myself. It might have been the flu. It might have been, who cares? You're sick. I knew I'd get over it in a sense. I wasn't too bad, but you're isolated. I did isolate myself indoors, lots of rest. Your brain starts to get a little cabin fever itself. And then, and then when I was just recently traveling, and I was in Europe and going outdoors a lot and spending most of the day hiking around waterfalls, beautiful things in nature, I just felt clear. You know, it's as if everything, when I was indoors, I did feel brain fog and sluggish mentally. And it did feel like it was a cognitive decline temporarily. But then the opposite happened when I got myself into nature, into that fresh air, into the movie. Yeah. Even there is, of course, the science of negative ions, the science of being around and biophilic design, all these things that show us that it has this great impact.